Butler National Golf Course, outside Chicago, June 1975. A storm has rolled in fast enough to catch a tournament full of professionals still out on the course, and players are hurrying for shelter under anything that looks solid. Lee Trevino, already a five-time major champion and one of the most recognizable faces in the sport, sits down on a metal golf bag rack near the edge of a lake to wait it out. Then the sky opens with a single bolt of lightning, and it finds him. He's thrown to the ground, his back and neck absorbing damage that will leave him with permanently herniated spinal discs and a form of chronic nerve pain that doesn't fully go away for the rest of his life. So here's the version of this story that seems to write itself. A freak act of nature struck down a superstar in his prime, and Lee Trevino's career as an elite, major championship-winning golfer effectively ended that afternoon on a lakeshore outside Chicago. Except that's not what happened. What actually happened is that a man doctors told to accept a diminished version of his career instead spent years secretly re-engineering the most fundamental motion in his sport, in private, against medical advice, until his own spine simply couldn't stop him anymore. Here's the real question this video is going to answer. How does a golfer who's just been told by doctors that competing at the elite level again is effectively finished go on to win a major championship 9 years later at 44 years old, playing what he would later describe as some of the best golf of his entire life? That's not a story about luck or about a body that simply healed on its own. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back before the lightning, before the fame, to where that swing came from in the first place, because the swing he built to survive his injury only makes sense once you understand the swing he had to give up. Lee Trevino did not come up through country clubs. He grew up outside Dallas, Texas, raised in genuinely difficult circumstances, and found golf the way a lot of working-class kids of that era found it, not as a leisure pursuit handed down by a father with club membership, but as a hustle, a way to make money off people with more resources and less skill. He taught himself the game largely without formal instruction, hitting balls for hours at a modest public range, developing feel through sheer repetition rather than textbook mechanics. Out of that self-taught process came a golf swing that looked almost nothing like the polished, upright motions coming out of the country club system that dominated professional golf at the time. Trevino played from an open stance, with a swing that produced a low, boring fade, a shot that started left of the target and curved back with just enough shape to land soft and hold the line. A shot he could hit into a stiff wind with a control that more classically trained players struggle to match even in calm conditions. Inside the sport, that shot eventually became known simply as his bullet, and it became, in a very real sense, his signature, the thing that separated a Trevino tee shot from anyone else's on tour, recognizable in silhouette before the ball had even landed. Before we continue, I would really appreciate it if you dropped a subscribe on the channel and a like on this video. It helps a ton. There was a practical logic behind that low, boring ball flight that went beyond simple preference. In the hustling matches that funded his early years, distance and height mattered far less than reliability, the ability to put a shot exactly where it needed to land, over and over, regardless of wind or nerves or the size of the bet riding on the outcome. A towering, showy shot might win a single hole. A low, repeatable fade that rarely missed its line won a season's worth of matches against players who were betting real money on the assumption that a self-taught kid from outside Dallas couldn't possibly compete with their formal instruction. That environment, where every shot carried a financial consequence and there was no instructor to blame for a bad result, built a kind of mental toughness and self-reliance that would define his entire approach to the game once he turned professional. Picture him now on that public driving range outside Dallas, because this image is going to matter again later, under very different circumstances. Not the pristine, manicured practice facilities of a private club, but a working man's range, worn grass and mats, Trevino grinding through bucket after bucket in near anonymity, building a motion nobody was teaching him, refining it purely against the feedback of where the ball actually went. That relentless, self-directed repetition would end up defining his entire career. Open in 1968 as a virtually unknown professional, it stunned a golf establishment that hadn't seen him coming and didn't quite know what to make of a champion who talked constantly on the course, joked with the gallery mid-round, and hit a shot shape most instructors of the era would have tried to coach out of a student rather than build a career around. That victory carried a particular weight inside a sport that, at the time, was still overwhelmingly shaped by a country club culture Trevino had never belonged to. Professional golf in the late 1960s remained, in many respects, a game of pedigree, where the top of the leaderboard tended to be populated by players who'd come up through the same well-funded junior programs and college golf teams, coached from an early age in a fairly uniform technical style. Trevino's arrival at the top of that leaderboard, with an open stance and a self-taught fade nobody in that establishment had built into him, forced the sport to reckon with the fact that its own assumptions about where great golf came from had simply been wrong. He wasn't an anomaly tolerated at the margins. He became, within a few short years, one of its biggest draws. What followed that first major victory was one of the more remarkable stretches in the sport during that era. Trevino added 4 more major championships over the following years, developed a reputation as one of the most reliably clutch performers in golf, and became, alongside his obvious skill, one of the most beloved and charismatic figures the game had ever produced. A working-class Texan who talked his way through pressure situations that left other players silent and tight-jawed, and somehow played some of his best golf while doing it. Direct address here, because it matters for what comes next. By 1975, Lee Trevino wasn't simply a good player having a good run. He was, by every reasonable measure, one of the best golfers alive, with a signature swing that had already proven itself against the best fields in the world. There's an obvious villain in this story, and honestly, it's tempting to just leave it there and move on, because in the most literal sense, it's true. A bolt of lightning struck Lee Trevino on a Chicago golf course in June 1975, and that lightning strike is the direct physical cause of the spinal damage that nearly ended his career. But treating the lightning itself as the full explanation for what almost happened next skips over the actual decision that mattered. Lightning is an event. It happens in an instant and then it's over. What determined the rest of Trevino's career wasn't that single instant. It was a much quieter, much more deliberate choice he made in the months and years that followed, sitting across from doctors who told him, in plain terms, that the herniated discs and nerve damage in his lower back meant the violent spinal rotation his swing depended on was no longer something his body could sustain at a competitive level. That prognosis, not the storm itself, is the real turn in this story. Trevino was handed, essentially, a professional death sentence dressed up in medical language. And rather than accept it, he decided, privately, to see if there was another way to hit a golf ball that didn't require the spine he no longer had. What he came up with, worked out gradually and mostly alone, was a genuinely radical mechanical solution for a player who'd already won 5 majors doing things the old way. Traditional golf swings, at the level Trevino had played them for over a decade, generate much of their power through rotation, the spine twisting back on the backswing and then uncoiling explosively through impact. Exactly the kind of torque his newly damaged discs could no longer safely absorb. So Trevino began re-engineering his lower body action almost from scratch, teaching himself to slide his hips laterally through the downswing, rather than rotating his spine to generate that same power. It's a subtle-sounding adjustment described in a single sentence. In practice, it meant unlearning a motion that had produced 5 major championships and millions of golf shots, and replacing it with something closer to a completely different athletic movement, one built specifically to root power around an injury rather than through the part of his body that could no longer handle it. Think about what that actually required from him, physically and mentally, at an age when most professional athletes are simply trying to maintain what already works rather than reinvent it from the ground up. The lateral slide he was teaching himself wasn't a minor tweak to grip pressure or ball position, the kind of small adjustment golfers make constantly throughout a season. It meant retraining the sequencing of an entire athletic motion, teaching his hips and legs to generate force through a completely different pathway than the one his body had relied on instinctively for over a decade of competitive golf. Muscle memory built over that many years doesn't simply switch off because a doctor delivers a diagnosis. Every round, every practice session meant actively fighting the instinct to fall back into the rotational pattern that had made him a 5-time major champion, the same pattern his spine could no longer safely produce. That process didn't happen quickly, and it didn't happen in public. For years, Trevino worked through it largely out of the spotlight, managing chronic nerve pain that never fully disappeared, testing an unconventional lower body action that had no real precedent among elite players, with no guarantee it would ever hold up under the pressure of a major championship back 9. Meanwhile, the golf world outside that private process drew its own, much simpler conclusions. Trevino went 8 years without a major championship victory following the lightning strike, An eternity by the standards of a player who'd once won 5 of them in barely 6 seasons. Commentators and columnists, watching a player in visible physical discomfort, posting results well below his earlier peak, wrote the story the way it looked from the outside. A great champion, struck down by an act of nature, gradually fading into his 40s the way most golfers eventually do, just with a more dramatic origin story attached to the decline. Picture that same driving range image again, except now imagine it relocated to a tour practice ground sometime in the late 1970s, years into this quiet reconstruction. It's no longer a young hustler building a swing out of pure natural feel. It's a 5-time major champion in his own late 30s, working through visible pain, drilling an unfamiliar lateral hip slide over and over, trying to make a completely different power source feel as automatic under pressure as the old rotational swing once had. There's nothing glamorous about that image, and almost nobody outside his closest circle was watching it happen. That contrast between the free-swinging young hustler on a Dallas public range and the disciplined, pained veteran rebuilding his mechanics from the ground up is really the emotional center of this entire stretch of his career. There were moments during that 8-year drought that looked briefly like the old Trevino was fully back. Strong finishes, flashes of the bullet fade landing exactly where he wanted it, results that had commentators floating comeback narratives a full major or two before the actual breakthrough arrived. Looking back at those moments now, they read less like the real turnaround and more like proof of concept, evidence that the lateral slide mechanics could work under real tournament pressure before they were fully dialed in to hold up across 4 consecutive competitive rounds. I'll be honest, the more I looked into this stretch of Trevino's career, the less it read to me as a comeback story in the usual sense, and the more it read as a story about a man quietly refusing to let a single afternoon of bad luck be the last word on what his body was allowed to do. Most players told what he was told by doctors in 1975 would have had every reasonable justification to wind down a Hall of Fame career on their own terms. Trevino instead spent nearly a decade in relative obscurity, rebuilding a fundamentally different golf swing around a spine that had already told him no once. In August 1984, at Shoal Creek in Alabama, at 44 years old, Lee Trevino won the PGA Championship. He didn't just win it, he played some of the most complete golf of his career doing it. And by his own account afterward, he did it largely free of the chronic pain that had defined nearly a decade of his competitive life since that afternoon on the lake shore outside Chicago. The swing that won that championship wasn't the swing that won his first 5 majors. It was the one he'd built almost entirely in private, out of necessity, refined through years most of the golf world had already written off as a slow fade into irrelevance. Think about the specific weight of that particular week at Shoal Creek. Trevino wasn't simply competing against a strong field of players in their physical prime, many of them a decade or more younger than him. He was doing it on a course in the middle of an Alabama summer, walking every hole across 4 competitive rounds on a spine that, 9 years earlier, doctors had told him would never again reliably support tournament-level golf. The margin for error in that kind of physical test is unforgiving. A swing built to protect an injury still has to hold up, shot after shot, under exactly the kind of pressure that exposes any mechanical weakness a player is carrying. Trevino's held, not just for one dramatic round, but across the entire tournament, closing it out with the kind of composed, confident golf that had defined his best years before the lightning ever struck. So here's the answer to the question this video opened with. How does a golfer told his elite career was effectively over come back nearly a decade later to win a major, seemingly pain-free, at an age when most champions are already well past their competitive peak? Not through recovery in the passive sense, the body simply healing with time, through a deliberate, years-long act of mechanical reinvention, undertaken quietly against a medical prognosis that offered him every reasonable excuse to stop trying. The lightning didn't end his career. It ended one specific way of swinging a golf club. Lee Trevino spent the better part of a decade finding another one. Go back one final time to that lake shore outside Chicago, the storm rolling in, the metal bag rack, the single instant that could have closed the book on one of the great careers in golf. What that afternoon actually did wasn't end anything. It forced a 5-time major champion to solve a problem no elite player before him had ever really had to solve at that level, and to solve it almost entirely alone in the years nobody was paying attention. If a story like that, a champion quietly rebuilding himself from the ground up rather than accepting the ending he'd been handed, is the kind of history that stays with you, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell.